For 35 years, I fell asleep next to a man I believed I understood. For 35 years, I trusted the quiet between us. And for 35 years, every sunrise hid a truth that was slowly destroying him. My name is Mary Helen. I am 78 years old. And today, I'm finally telling the story I once swore I would take to my grave. Not because I want sympathy, not because I want attention, but because silence nearly broke the man I loved. Before I begin, I want you to understand something about the time I grew up in. In those days, women didn't ask many questions. We were taught that love meant patience, and that marriage meant endurance. I was just 21 when I met Joseph in 1967. It was at a small church gathering on Chicago's South Side. No loud music. No flirting. Just polite smiles and careful conversation. Joseph was 24, soft-spoken, and serious in a way that made him seem older than his years. He worked long hours at a steel mill in Indiana, came home exhausted and never complained. My father, a strict man who trusted few people, approved of him almost immediately. That approval meant everything. We dated the old-fashioned way. Living room visits, doors open, my mother never far away. When Joseph proposed in 1968, I cried so hard I couldn't speak. We married that winter in a small church ceremony with more prayers than guests. Our life was simple, hard but honest. Joseph worked. I kept the home. We saved every dollar. And for a while, I believed we were happy. But there was something strange from the very beginning. Every single morning, without exception, Joseph woke up at exactly 4 a.m. Not 3:58. Not 4:02. Exactly 4 o'clock. He moved carefully, slowly, as if even the bed creaking was dangerous. Then he went straight to the bathroom downstairs, locked the door, and stayed there for almost an hour. At first, I told myself it was nothing. New marriages come with awkward habits. Bodies have problems people don't talk about. So I stayed quiet. But days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. The routine never changed. For in the morning, locked door. An hour of silence. Sometimes I heard water running, not like someone bathing, but quick, controlled bursts. Other times, nothing at all. Just a strange, heavy quiet that pressed against my chest. Once early in our marriage, I finally asked, "Joseph," I said gently over breakfast, "are you feeling all right? You wake up so early every day." His reaction startled me. He didn't look angry. He looked afraid. His face flushed red. He avoided my eyes and stirred his coffee until it went cold. "It's nothing," he said. "Just something I've had since I was a boy. Don't worry." And just like that, the conversation ended. Back then, women didn't push. So neither did I. We had children. We built a life. And that early morning ritual stayed with us like an unspoken guest in our home. I tried to convince myself it meant nothing. But deep down, something inside me whispered that it meant everything. And I had no idea that one day, long after the children were grown and the years had worn us thin, I would finally learn what my husband was hiding behind that locked door. A truth so painful, so carefully buried, that discovering it would change how I saw love, strength, and silence forever. What I didn't know then was that every morning at 4 a.m., my husband wasn't just hiding from me. He was hiding from a past that refused to let him heal. Years passed, and life moved forward the way life always does, quietly, relentlessly, without asking permission. We had our first child in 1970. Then another 2 years later. Our small house filled with noise, toys, and laughter. Joseph became a father the only way he knew how. By working harder, coming home tired, and loving us silently. He never raised his voice. Never drank. Never stayed out late. By every standard of that time, he was a good husband. And yet, the mystery followed us. Every morning, without fail, Joseph rose at 4 o'clock. Not even sickness stopped him. Not holidays. Not Sundays. I learned to wake just before he did. My body trained by years of listening. I would lie still in the dark, pretending to sleep, counting his breaths as he sat up and carefully placed his feet on the floor. He always paused for a moment, pressing a hand against his lower back, breathing deeply, like someone preparing for pain. Then he disappeared downstairs. The sounds were never normal. There was no coughing, no shuffling, no signs of an ordinary routine. Instead, I heard brief bursts of water, followed by long stretches of silence. Sometimes a faint rustle, like paper or plastic being handled. Once in a great while a low, muffled sound escaped him. Not a cry, not a groan. Something held tightly inside. I told myself I was imagining things. But imagination doesn't keep you awake night after night. One afternoon, nearly 10 years into our marriage, I mentioned it to my mother. I expected concern, understanding, maybe even advice. Instead, she scolded me. "Mary Helen," she said sharply, "you are looking for trouble where there is none. Your husband works himself to the bone for this family. If he wants privacy, give it to him." And that was that. I felt ashamed for questioning him at all. So I swallowed my worries and learned to live with them. But the older Joseph became, the more inconsistencies appeared. He wore long-sleeved shirts year-round, even during brutal Chicago summers when sweat soaked through the fabric. When I asked why, he said it was for protection at work. Steel mills were dangerous places, he reminded me. It made sense. Until I realized he never removed his shirt in front of anyone. Not at home. Not at the beach. Not even with me. Our intimacy happened in darkness. Always darkness. When I once reached for the lamp, his body stiffened as if I'd touched a nerve. "I like it this way," he said quickly. "It's better." I let it go. But then there were the moments of pain. Joseph would sit on the couch, watching television, and suddenly his face would tighten. His hand would move instinctively to his side or back, his jaw clenching as if he were bracing against something invisible. "Are you okay?" I'd ask. "Just tired," he'd reply. "Heavy work." Again, it made sense. Until it happened more often. By the time our children left home, the house grew quiet, and the silence made everything louder. There were no distractions anymore. No toys. No bedtime routines. Just the ticking clock, counting down to 4 a.m. One night, after more than 25 years of marriage, I finally confronted him. "I need to know what you do in that bathroom," I said. "I'm not a fool." Joseph went pale. Not angry. Not defensive. Terrified. "Please," he whispered. "Don't ask me this." Tears filled his eyes, real tears I had never seen before. "I'm not doing anything wrong," he said. "But I can't tell you. I can't." And then he said something that froze me to my core. "It's to protect you and the children." That night, he walked out of the house and didn't return for hours. And as I lay awake alone, one truth became undeniable. Whatever Joseph was hiding, it wasn't small. I didn't know what scared me more, the secret itself, or the realization that my husband had been carrying it alone for decades. After that argument, nothing was the same. Joseph never mentioned our conversation again. And neither did I. But silence has weight. And ours grew heavier with every passing day. I began noticing things I had ignored for years. Not because they were new, but because I could no longer pretend they were harmless. Joseph visited the pharmacy far too often. Sometimes once a week. Sometimes more. He always returned with small bags he hid quickly, slipping them into the bathroom cabinet or the back of the closet. When I asked what they were, he shrugged. "Pain medicine," he said. "Old age catching up with me." But the smell told a different story. Every morning after he left the bathroom, the air carried a sharp, medicinal scent, ointments, antiseptics, things meant for wounds, not ordinary aches. Why would anyone need those every day, and only at dawn? The question gnawed at me. The year 2003 arrived quietly, but something inside me shifted. I was 54 by then. The children were grown. The house echoed. And the secrets I had lived with for decades suddenly felt unbearable. One night in March, the air was thick with heat and restlessness. I couldn't sleep. Joseph lay beside me, breathing unevenly, as if pain followed him even into dreams. At 3:55 a.m., his body tensed. I watched him through barely open eyes as he pressed a hand against his back and inhaled deeply. A ritual I now recognized as preparation. Then he stood, went to the closet, and pulled something out. A towel. And a plastic pharmacy bag. That was the moment I knew. This was not habit. This was necessity. He left the room quietly. My heart hammered so loudly I was certain he could hear it. I lay still for several minutes, fighting myself. Spying on your spouse was unthinkable, where I came from. Disrespectful. Shameful. But after 35 years of unanswered questions, shame felt lighter than ignorance. I wrapped my robe around me and followed. The bathroom light glowed beneath the door downstairs. Water ran briefly, then stopped. I stood frozen in the hallway, my hand pressed against the wall to steady myself. Then I heard it. A sound so quiet it could have been mistaken for imagination. But I knew better. A moan. Not frustration. Not annoyance. Pain. The kind you try to swallow so no one else hears. My legs trembled. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to return to bed and forget everything. But something stronger pushed me forward. The door was old, and the keyhole wide. I knelt slowly, my knees aching, and leaned close. At first, my eyes couldn't adjust. Just shadows. Movement. Then my vision cleared. Joseph stood with his back to the door, shirtless. And what I saw shattered me. His back was a map of suffering. Scars layered over scars. Burns. Deep marks that looked like they had never fully healed. Some pale with age. Others red and angry, as if time had refused to touch them. He lifted his arm, revealing more wounds beneath, then pressed gauze against one open mark near his ribs. His body curled inward as he bit down on a towel to keep from crying out. Tears streamed down his face. He was suffering in silence, alone, every single morning. I covered my mouth to keep from screaming. I stumbled backward, my vision blurring, and fled upstairs before he could sense my presence. I slid into bed, shaking violently. The images burned into my mind. When Joseph returned 40 minutes later, I lay perfectly still. But sleep never came. Because I finally understood something terrifying. The man I loved hadn't been hiding a habit. He had been hiding a wound that never healed. And what I still didn't know was who had done this to him, and why fear had kept him silent for 35 years. The days after that night were unbearable. I woke each morning with the same image burned behind my eyes. Joseph's scarred back, the trembling in his hands, the way he bit down on a towel to silence his pain. I went through the motions of life like a ghost. Cooking, cleaning, smiling when necessary, pretending. Joseph noticed, of course. He always noticed more than he let on. "Are you feeling all right?" he asked one evening as we sat at the dinner table, the food untouched between us. "I didn't sleep well," I replied. It wasn't a lie. Just not the whole truth. A week later, the truth refused to stay hidden. It happened on a quiet Saturday afternoon. Joseph was in the backyard repairing a loose fence post. I was inside preparing lunch when I heard a sudden crash, followed by a sound that froze my blood. A cry of pain. I ran outside and found him on the ground, clutching his back, his face drained of color, sweat pouring down his temples. "I slipped," he gasped. "My back, it locked." I dropped beside him, panic shaking my hands. As I tried to help him sit up, his shirt rode up slightly, and I saw them again. The scars. Fresh in daylight. One near his ribs had reopened, a thin line of blood seeping through. Joseph followed my gaze, and in that moment, everything collapsed. He stopped resisting. He looked at me with eyes full of fear, shame, and exhaustion. "You saw," he whispered. I nodded. Tears streamed freely now. "I saw. That night through the door." For a long moment he said nothing. Then his shoulders sagged, as if 35 years of silence finally crushed him. "I never wanted you to know," he said quietly. "I thought I could protect you if I stayed quiet." "Protect me from what?" I asked, my voice breaking. He didn't answer. Inside, I helped him to the bed and sat beside him while he lay face down, breathing through the pain. I placed my hand gently on his shoulder, afraid even my touch might hurt him. "Please," I said. "No more secrets." He closed his eyes. "I'm afraid," he admitted. "Afraid you'll look at me differently. Afraid you'll see me as weak." I took his face in my hands and made him look at me. "After everything we've lived through. Do you really believe that?" Tears slipped from his eyes. "I was young," he said. "Too young to understand what fear can do to a man." That night, we barely slept. At dawn, Joseph didn't go to the bathroom. He stayed beside me, staring at the ceiling. When morning came, he finally spoke again. "I'll tell you," he said. "But not today. I need time." I waited. The next morning, he shaved carefully, dressed neatly, and sat across from me at the kitchen table as if preparing for judgment. "It happened before we married," he said. "Back in 1969. My hands trembled around my coffee cup. "I was taken," he continued, "by men who said they were protecting the country." My heart pounded. They thought I was someone else. Someone dangerous. I listened, barely breathing, as he described being grabbed after work, blindfolded, and thrown into a car. A place with no windows. No merci. They wanted names, he said. They wanted confessions. His voice cracked. And when I couldn't give them what they wanted, they made me suffer. I reached for his hand as he spoke of beatings, burns, and days that blended into endless nights. He admitted he broke, not because he was weak, but because pain leaves no room for pride. "They let me go when they realized their mistake," he said. "But before they did, they warned me." My chest tightened. "They told me if I spoke to anyone, even you, they'd come back." Silence filled the kitchen. "I carried it alone," he whispered. "Every scar. Every morning. Every year." I squeezed his hand. "And you don't have to anymore." What I didn't yet understand was how deeply those 4 days had shaped every moment of the 35 years that followed. Once the truth was spoken, I believed the worst part was over. I was wrong. Telling the story didn't erase the damage, it exposed it. In the days that followed Joseph's confession, I began to see him differently. Not weaker, not broken, but wounded in ways I had never understood. Every movement, every pause, every silence suddenly had a history. The mornings were the hardest. At exactly 4 a.m., his body still woke on instinct. Years of fear had trained him better than any alarm clock. At first he tried to rise alone, the old habit refusing to die. "No," I said softly, placing my hand over his. "Not alone anymore." He hesitated, then nodded. For the first time in 35 years, the bathroom door stayed unlocked. Helping him clean the wounds was unbearable at first. Some scars were so old they looked like part of him. Others were raw, stubborn, refusing to heal properly even after decades. The smell of medicine filled the room, but now it wasn't secretive, it was shared. Joseph never complained, but sometimes his hands shook. And sometimes, when I touched a particular spot, he flinched like a frightened child. Those moments hurt more than the wounds themselves. "I should have been stronger," he said one morning, staring at the sink instead of his reflection. "You survived," I answered. "That's strength." But Joseph wasn't only carrying pain in his body. He carried guilt. He told me about the people taken after him. The priest who led their group. Young men who never fully returned. One who never came back at all. "I gave false names," he said quietly. "But what if something I said led them to the others?" I held his face in my hands and made him look at me. "You were being tortured. You had no control." He nodded, but I knew guilt doesn't disappear just because logic tells it to. Sleep didn't come easily after the truth surfaced. The nightmares returned, louder this time. There were nights he woke screaming, drenched in sweat, his eyes wild with memories that refused to stay buried. I learned how to ground him, to whisper his name, to remind him where he was, to hold him until the shaking stopped. One evening, I suggested something that terrified him more than any scar. "Talk to someone," I said. "A professional." He shook his head immediately. "I've handled it this long." "And it's cost you 35 years, I replied gently. It took weeks, but he agreed. The doctor didn't ask many questions. She didn't need to. When she saw his back, her expression said everything. She treated him with care, with dignity, not pity. With proper treatment, the wounds improved. Not completely. Some scars never would. But the pain eased little by little. The bigger change came when he started talking. About fear. About shame. About the lie that told him crying made him weak. Our children noticed the difference. They said we looked closer. Lighter. One afternoon, we sat them down and told them the truth. Not every detail, but enough. Our son cried. "I thought you didn't care," he said to his father. "I thought you were distant because of me." Joseph pulled him into his arms. I was distant because I was afraid of losing you. That day, something healed that none of us realized was broken. Years passed. Joseph lived another 15 years after telling his story. They weren't perfect years. Pain never fully left him. But they were honest years. Free years. On his last morning, long after illness had weakened his body, he held my hand and whispered something I'll never forget. Thank you for looking through that door. What he didn't know was that his story wasn't finished yet, and that his silence would one day become his legacy. The years after Joseph finally spoke were not easy, but they were real. For the first time in our marriage, nothing stood between us. No locked doors. No unspoken fears. No lies disguised as protection. What we shared instead was something fragile but powerful. Truth. Every morning at 4 a.m., his body still woke on instinct. Trauma doesn't disappear just because it's acknowledged. But now, those mornings were no longer filled with secrecy. Sometimes we sat together in silence while I helped him change the bandages. Other times we talked about memories we'd never allowed ourselves to revisit, about dreams we once thought were too late. Joseph laughed more. It surprised me at first. I had almost forgotten the sound. The pain never vanished completely. Cold weather still made his scars ache. Sudden noises still startled him. And there were days when his back stiffened so badly he could barely move. But something inside him had shifted. He no longer carried the shame. Therapy helped. Slowly, carefully, he learned that breaking under torture wasn't weakness. It was humanity. That surviving didn't mean being untouched. It meant enduring. Our children saw it too. They visited more often. Stayed longer. Conversations grew deeper. One afternoon, our daughter said something that made Joseph cry quietly at the table. Dad, she said, you're the bravest man I know. Not because you never fell apart, but because you kept going. He carried those words with him like armor. Time, however, is not gentle. Years passed. Joseph's body aged faster than his spirit. The scars that had defined his mornings for decades began to fade in importance as his heart grew tired. By 2018, his strength started slipping away. On his final days, the hospital room was quiet. Machines hummed softly. His breathing was shallow but steady. I sat beside him, holding the same hand I had held for over 50 years. He squeezed my fingers weakly. I wasted so much time hiding, he whispered. No, I said firmly. You survived until you were ready. He smiled faintly. Those last years, they were the best. When Joseph passed, something strange happened. I didn't feel only grief. I felt relief. Not that he was gone, but that he had finally known peace. That he had lived his final years unburdened by silence. The house felt emptier afterward. Too quiet. Especially at dawn. For months, I still woke at 4 a.m., my body trained by decades of routine. Sometimes I'd sit on the edge of the bed and imagine him beside me, preparing for another morning we no longer needed to fear. It took time to understand something important. Joseph's story didn't end with him. It lived on in our children. In their compassion. In their courage to speak. In their refusal to confuse silence with strength. Years later, at 78, I made the decision to tell this story publicly. Not to expose wounds. Not to reopen pain. But to remind others of something we're rarely taught. Survival is not weakness. Crying is not failure. And silence does not equal strength. Joseph carried his pain alone for 35 years, because he believed that was love. But the truth is this. Love is sharing the weight. And now, in the final part, I'll tell you why I waited until now. And why this story was never meant to stay buried. For a long time after Joseph passed, I believed this story belonged only to us. It felt sacred. Private. Too heavy for the world. I told myself that digging it up again would only reopen wounds that had finally healed. And for years, that was enough to keep me quiet. But silence has a way of echoing. The moment that changed everything came on an ordinary morning. The kind that arrives quietly and leaves just as unnoticed. I was standing in line at a pharmacy when I overheard a young man speaking to the clerk. His voice trembled as he asked for bandages and ointment. They're not for an injury, he said softly. I just need them. Something in his tone froze me in place. It was the same fear, the same shame, the same belief that pain must be hidden. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Joseph at that age, convinced that suffering alone made him strong, that protecting others meant erasing himself. I realized then why this story could no longer stay silent. Because there are still people waking up at 4 a.m., locking bathroom doors, and believing their pain is something to be endured instead of shared. I began writing, slowly at first. One page, then another. Every word felt like lifting a stone from my chest. I cried more than I wrote. But I didn't stop. Not for Joseph. For those who still believe silence equals strength. When our children read the finished pages, they held my hands and thanked me. Not because the story was painful, but because it explained so much. It makes sense now, our daughter said. Why Dad was the way he was. That's when I understood something I wish we'd known earlier. Understanding heals more than time ever can. If Joseph had spoken sooner, would his scars have healed faster? Maybe. Would his nights have been quieter? Possibly. But the truth is, he spoke when he was ready. And I am speaking now for the same reason. Because stories like his don't belong in the dark. They belong in the light, where others can recognize themselves and choose a different path. If you're listening to this and carrying something heavy, something you've convinced yourself is too shameful or too dangerous to share, please hear me. You are not weak for surviving. You are not broken for hurting. And you are not a burden for needing help. Joseph believed protecting his family meant suffering alone. But what truly protected us was the moment he finally let himself be seen. So this story isn't about scars. It's about love. About endurance. About the courage it takes to unlock a door you've kept closed for decades. And if telling it helps even one person step out of silence, then every painful memory was worth it. Because no one should have to suffer alone at 4 a.m.